So good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Strategy Café. We're very pleased to have everyone join us today for your shot of early morning leadership inspiration. So as you know, at the moment we are deciding to lean more into the leadership issues that COVID-19 has made way for. And so we're doing more regular strategy cafes to deliver some insight from the Alembic team as we all face this crisis together. So do check out previous webinars which cover crisis management, difficult conversations, issue ranking, and the latest one on coping with grief. So if any of these topics resonate with you, then do go back and listen by going to the Strategy Cafe page on our website. And also just a heads up, the next one is going to be on the 2nd of July, which is going to be on communication. So we're in a time where we are all trying to communicate in the right way with different methods. So David, our head of marketing, is going to lead us through how we should be communicating in this crazy time. So before we dig into the topic of decisive leadership, it's worth emphasising that we want this to be a conversation, and we can't possibly go into that much depth in half an hour, but we hope that this will trigger some more interesting conversations. So you try and cover the questions in the half an hour, but if you want to have a further conversation, it triggers a thought in your mind, then do just pick up the phone. We're always happy just to talk through whatever's going on for you. So you should find the questions area. We want this to be a conversation as we go, so just dive into that. We are going to be recording this, so that will be available to you afterwards, and will be wrapped up by 9:30 a.m. for you to start your day. So the format for today, so I'm Rosanna, and we've got the senior Alembic team with me online to talk about decisive leadership. So perhaps you could all say hi. So we've got Matt, a senior facilitator.
Morning, everyone.
We've got David, who runs marketing.
Morning, folks.
And we have Nick, the founder and CEO of Alembic.
Morning, everyone. Pleased to see you here on the webinar.
I think that's all the housekeeping. So we'll look out for your questions, and we hope to sort of start a conversation with you. So today we're going to be covering what is decisive leadership. So what do we really mean by decisive leadership? And when should we be leading decisively, and some things to look out for. And also, as you know, we're all about the practice of leadership. So we're going to be having a conversation about actually practicing. So what are the tips and techniques that we need to be practicing to be a decisive leader. So getting straight into the conversation then. So really making choices is a fundamental requirement of leaders, but the options are not always clear, and it can be tricky to make decisions, and we find that it's something that most people find tricky. Decisions can be uncomfortable, and so we just wanted to have a conversation about the difficult decisions that you might be making and how to step into decisive leadership. So really a question to start with for you is, why did you sign up for this webinar today? Why is decisive leadership interesting for you, and what is going to make this meaningful to you? So you may have chosen to dial in because you want to be more decisive. You might be working with somebody else who you want to be more decisive and make decisions in a different way, or actually that there's an absence of decision making, and actually so there's different reasons why you might have signed in to think about decisive leadership. So the point is that your attitude on decision making itself will be affecting your ability to make effective decisions. So what I mean by that is, you might feel decisions trigger emotions and bias, and they are strong contributors to flawed decision making. And so if you don't like making decisions, that in itself is going to affect your ability to make decisions when they're critical. We're going to be thinking about what emotions are at play and how we can manage those, but also some of the biases that we have when it comes to making the decisions, because emotions and biases are interrelated. So what do we mean by decisive leadership? So I think the point here is that it's not about making decisions on your own. There are many different types of leadership. So we have collaborative, there's autocratic, visionary, democratic. There's all sorts of labels you can put on leadership, and we all have preferences. But the most effective leaders step into the right style at the right time, and they know when to step into the visionary, they know when to step into the collaborative. And in times of crisis, the pace of everything steps up a gear, and you're having to make more decisions at pace with quite significant impact. And so it's about understanding your emotions and the biases at play that are affecting those decisions and making a choice with this in mind. So I thought actually we could start by just stopping here and talking to my colleagues about what makes somebody a decisive leader and what decisive leadership means. So perhaps Nick, you could kick off on your thoughts on decisive leadership.
Yeah, hello everybody. Just wanted to pick up on the point about emotion. One of our sayings is there's no such thing as an unemotional human being. We all have feelings, and when the pressure is on, those feelings typically are riding high. I always think in terms of decision making, there's quite often a pressure for a choice. And it's interesting to think about the choice of doing nothing in this context. So it's, in a way, it's decisive to say no, and it's decisive to say we're going to do nothing. That's quite an interesting thought. I think there's an action bias in crisis which makes you feel like you should do something, and quite often the answer might be not to, but that can be perceived as dither or procrastination. So I think the first thing to check in on is whether you feel that you are making a clear decision to do nothing and are prepared to take the heat on that, or whether you are making a decision to do, maybe your indecisiveness, your doing nothing, is dither or procrastination, which I would say is more led by the feelings. Does anyone else want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to move from there. There's an old saying, wait until you see the whites of their eyes, which I really like. I think it stems from Battlefield in terms of making your move. So holding your ground until you've got enough information or an advantage that you feel like now is actually the right time to move forward with this decision. This is going to give me the best footing that I can possibly have to get to win whatever the battle is. And obviously we're not talking about battles in the business, but some of them might be. But yeah, so there's that, and I think delaying can be really painful. So if you wait until you see too much whites of the eye, then you've left it too long, to your point about dithering, Nick. I think so. Making that judgment so that it's exactly the right time is really critical, but it's so hard, so hard.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that your sort of internal and external decision making can be quite different, and it does have a big effect on how people perceive you. Sort of lack of motion externally can lead to your team having sort of lack of confidence, but internally, if you're being decisive, then you can still be acting in your business's best interests. And sort of interestingly, really being decisive is no good measure of how good the decision that you're making is going to be. So it's sort of important to get that balance between being decisive and making a good decision.
Yeah, I think that's a really strong point, because actually it's about the perception of being seen to make a decision, but to what end? And so we'll come on to the action bias a bit later, but it's really interesting that not making a decision actually can be really decisive, because decisions are actually about just getting all the information that you need, and if you don't have that and you're not ready, then what's the rush? So I think it's about perception of why you're not making a decision, and that's fundamentally down to communicating that. So we're not currently making a decision because, I think really important. So just moving the conversation on, I think I'm just getting a bit of feedback. Sorry, so all decisions are emotional. You know, there's a myth that we should be making rational decisions in business, but decisions are not rational or irrational. They're on a scale, and there's logic, and we need to go and get the information, the data, but there also are feelings and emotions that are there too. And the anatomy of the brain is such that you can't make a decision without emotion. So it's just how much emotion there is involved in the decision making. So the level of emotion is dependent on the context. So it's dependent on how much experience you have in that decision, how much information you have, your perception of the impact. I mean, they say don't make decisions when you're hungry, and there's loads of research about in criminal trials about verdicts before and after lunch and the difference. So, you know, hunger makes people impatient and irritable, and so that's a physiological response, and so it's understanding all the different factors at play when you're making a decision. The other point is that it's like the granularity of emotions. So we think of happy, sad, joy, anger, but there's actually loads of different emotions that spill out of those very broad categories. And so I just wanted to make the point of being aware of what that emotion is and getting right the granularity of that emotion. So if it's frustration, what type of frustration is it? And really understanding, and is that really a emotion that you want to be making a decision from? So just tune into that when you're making those decisions that you know might feel quite big, substantial, or quite urgent. So just check in on those emotions, but emotions are always there. So we need to just check in on them, on what are they, and manage them in a way that the emotion is useful, not unhelpful. So I just to throw it out, I mean, when we were talking earlier, Dava, you were talking about the power of emotions in communicating a message. I just wondered whether you wanted to talk to this slide on emotion.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, the empathetic leader is in tune with his own emotions, and therefore invokes a level of trust which comes through transparency with their team. And emotions are telltale. You can't hide them. They speak volumes. So you can be saying one thing, but your emotions can be communicating something completely different, and people will pick up on that. And so the empathetic leader who's in tune with those emotions is more likely to invoke trust from a team, and therefore be a more inspirational leader by default, just by being in touch.
Yeah, we were talking about the metaphor of the singer. So the singer with the lyrics, which are very emotive, and the control that the singer must have to convey the emotion enough but still regain the control of the note with clarity, and that control that's needed to bring enough emotion to be able to convey the message, but not too much that they embody the emotion too much and aren't able to deliver the point. So I guess the point is how to rebalance the emotion in the right way, and I think that's about getting the information and getting the data to support that emotion.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think there's a sliding scale, isn't there, in terms of power? So you have the power, the emotional power, of taking people through a decision because you want them to completely commit to it, and so that requires confidence and control, but you need to get that tone up and reach out and get people's hearts. And then the other side of the dial, you're really talking about the reason, and the power there is about convincing with the facts and the why. So the two are very, the interplay of the two is really important, and I think it's really knowing how to dial down and dial up, practicing being able to dial down and dial up, but not going too far that you lose control at the top end of emotion, or that you're too neutral and boring at the other end of the facts. So it's just a real balancing act.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on one of the emotions. So fear comes up quite a lot in decision making. So it's worry about making the wrong decision, worried that you don't have enough information. And there's an acronym for fear, which is false evidence appearing real. So you might be looking at something and that fear is a trigger for actually, do you have enough information? So the fear is, it can be a signal to you that you just need to go and find some more information. Something that's really helped me is just to go and find all the sort of contrary evidence to that. So sort of like, well, here are all the reasons why my decision, but I still feel fearful about that. So go and look for contrary evidence. So it's about listening to the emotion, and if that is fear, go and find some more information to prove or disprove, just to help. So it's not to say lead with emotions. Logic is still important, information is still important, but it's using our emotions as triggers to go, okay, well, what do we need, and what information do we need to go and look for? So just moving the conversation on then. So obviously we think about decisive leadership as one way of leading. So when should we step into decisive leadership? Because sometimes actually it's really good to not make the decision and pass on the decision making to others and be more collaborative. So we were thinking about all the ways in which we step into decisive leadership, and really it comes down to sort of three main things. So what's the cost of failure? So this image is sort of swimming with sharks, and that's about risk. So financial risk, so what's the sort of pure cost? How big is the like the scale of the failure, what's the risk there, and what's the impact going to be? So that could be yes, financial, but also your reputation. So we need to be getting the maximum information about all those things. The other thing is about stepping into decisive leadership is there's an urgent need, and so there's a pressing need to do this quickly. And then the final thing was about this culture of inertia. So actually, sometimes where there's a culture of non-decision making, it's about communicating and what decisions can we make to demonstrate that there's a culture of decision making throughout the organization. And it's as much about when as it is how. So it's about when to step into it and when not to. So obviously there are times where actually being decisive is not necessarily the preferred leadership style. But I think in the case of a crisis where we've got lots of decisions to make, everything that we have to understand what the cost of failure is. We have to try and prioritize the different needs and what's more urgent, and try and encourage a culture of everybody making decisions, and that's about practice. So these three factors trigger a high pressure load on the decision itself. This image here is just showing that when a decision is sort of more emotionally loaded, or the pressure is of a higher load, it's harder. And so where are you making decisions on this scale here? When it's easier, there's perhaps a more experienced leadership team, there's maybe lower complexity, there's less of that urgency, and the cost of failure is lower. But the pressure of this decision increases when perhaps our experience is less, there's more complexity, there's more time pressure, and there's increased cost of failure. So how do we make decisions then? So I wanted to just raise your awareness to some of the biases that are at play. And there are, like, you can have quite a lot of fun with the biases. There's like hundreds to be aware of. I mean, just go to Wikipedia and there's a really sort of curious list of sort of very interesting biases. But I just want to bring out the sort of 5 key things to be aware of. So the first one is status quo versus action bias. So Nick has already referenced this earlier, but so the status quo bias is the preference for the current state of affairs. So if there is a culture of inertia, the preference is to not make the decision. The counterpoint to that is that action bias is where the tendency to make a decision for decision's sake. So it's about being seen to make a decision. What is it like in your organization? What are your biases? What do you think your biases are? Status quo versus action. Do you have a preference? And what is happening when the pressure's on? Do you freeze, so the flight or flight freeze? Do you sort of just withdraw from making the decision, or do you step more into making a decision to seem to be doing something? Optimism and pessimism is a really interesting bias or preference. So some people are more optimistic. So we'll see decision outcomes more optimistic or pessimistic. Do you tend to be more optimistic or pessimistic? And we come on to the diversity, but if you're more optimistic, is it better to have pessimistic people around you to get that counterbalance? Loss aversion. So this is the perceived what's it like to give up something versus to gain something. So there's an experiment that demonstrates that people will need to gain twice as much than they're willing to lose. So the experiment was just a coin toss bet. So if the coin came up tails, then the person would lose $100. And if it came up heads, then they would win $200. So the results of the experiment showed that on average, people need to gain twice as much as they're willing to lose. And so that can inhibit our decision making if we think that the gains are not outweighing the costs or the loss. So it's just an interesting bias to be aware of in terms of making a decision. There's also confirmation bias. So when we're making decisions, are we looking to confirm what we already know? So as I was saying before, a really good counterpoint is to seek opposing information rather than confirmatory evidence. And then the final thing is groupthink, or herd mentality. So they're slightly different, but of the same ilk, where we are social creatures, it's the bias that when we're in a group of people, we have a bias towards harmony or conformity rather than challenging the actual outcome of the decision. So we are more likely to go with what the group thinks rather than properly evaluating critically the alternative viewpoints that might be had. So it's just interesting to think about these biases that are at play. So moving the conversation on, so what does that mean, and how do you step into decisive leadership knowing all of those biases, knowing all of those emotions? How are we going to do that? So we'll probably just have a conversation about this as a group. So diversify your thoughts. So working in groups. So the research is that the more diverse your decision-making group is, the better. And so group decisions are always better than individual groups. And the more diverse that group is, the better. And so that's quite idealistic if your decision-making formats are relatively fixed. So what can you actually do about changing the demographic of your groups? That's quite difficult to do, to implement quickly. So there's a perspective exercise. I mean, there's loads of perspective exercises that we do, but that should say 6 hats thinking. 6 hits thinking might be might be a slightly different exercise. So 6 hats thinking encourages you to wear different hats. So if you have optimism bias, go and put a pessimistic hat on, and what decision would you make? What information would you want to seek out? So it encourages 6 different perspectives, or makes you sit in maybe of different biases, and that's a really good practical way that you can take away to sort of increase the diversity of thought, just to make sure you're seeking out all the different viewpoints. I just wondered, on diversifying your thoughts, whether the rest of the team had any other points to make on that.
I'll jump in if you like. So I think, let's talk about the high pressure situation for a bit. So just referencing that point and the earlier conversation about emotion. So under high pressure, what it does is it drives biases on the previous side. So they're more likely to be in play when there's high levels of emotion in the decision. So there's high pressure situations. So I think having a diversity of thinking around you can work, but you have to create a structure that allows that to be powerful. So in a board context, it's choosing different mindsets, people that bring different types of counsel. Trust has to be built in the team from a human perspective, and also in the rules of the board. You need to have a culture in the board where you can really be honest. We talk about radical honesty, and certainly within the board in these high pressure situations, you need it. You need to be able to argue without falling out. So it's taking that level of emotional discussion to a high point, but not losing it with each other, and then resolving. And I think just the last point here is that, at some point you need to make a call. So if the group can't make a call, the CEO will make a call, and that call has to be made with confidence and with unity to bring everybody on board with it. So the clarity of that call is really important. Even if the confidence isn't there on the inside, you have to manage that and just call it and make the decision and see what happens. You can always then change tack if you had missed some critical piece of information. And most times there's an opportunity for revision a little bit further down the track. So just ultimately having the confidence to call it, and the accountability obviously goes with that. So the call has accountability, and you have to own it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think leading on is the practice of that. So you touched on creating a culture of debate and challenge, and I think that leads on to the practice. So we have to practice when the dial is sort of on the low load, so that when the pressure comes up, we have that practice to be able to do that, and we know that we can do it because we've done it before on sort of lower load or lower pressure decisions. So encouraging to practice those in forums, and just it builds the trust in each other that actually a different viewpoint is helpful, rather than triggering the defensiveness that it can do.
Sorry, Rosanna, I was just going to add to that. I think also in your mix, you've got the person ultimately is going to make the call, like CEO. This is also where the chair is really important and needs to have very strong connection with everybody, just to, because when when these difficult, high pressure, fast moving decisions are happening, and so therefore the bias and the emotion is running. What can happen at that point is people can kind of move into much more of a sort of a position, an emotionally held position about things, where we need to be is to still be curious, still be open, still be debating. And so it's just the chair's role in that point is just to call that out and ask people to dial it down when they just sense that it's gone a little bit too, for example, into identity politics, or into a but kind of argument rather than a yes and kind of argument.
Yes.
And so you need really careful chairing just to tease that emotional debate out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just coming up to 9:30, so just please, we're going to continue the conversation for the next few minutes, but do pile in with your questions just as we're on this final slide, just talking about how to step into decisive leadership. So if you have questions, then we'll take them after this slide. So I just wanted to invite the others to sort of comment on this slide. So David, what are your thoughts on these sort of 5 tips?
I'm going to focus in on culture because I think that plays a really important part in decision making. Sometimes challenging a decision might be tricky depending on who's chairing the decision. To Nick's point earlier about the accountability levels, because in some organisations mistakes are punished, and so therefore the wrong decision comes so loaded it puts you at that high end of the pressure scale and makes the decision really quite challenging to make without loading it with emotion. And so how do you create a culture where decision making is encouraged, especially if it's a potentially toxic culture? So I think to start to answer that, you've got to just acknowledge the fact that maybe your culture doesn't have the right characteristics to make decisions first up.
Yeah,
before moving on from there.
Yeah, David, I think that's a really good point, because I think if you're starting to think about creating a culture at the time where there's quite a lot of pressure, it's just quite loaded. So it just is, you don't have the practice, and so the failure and the emotion that sort of potential failure might bring, it inhibits us. And so to develop a culture of it, we need to start practicing down here. And so that's what decisions can we pass off and help other people make a decision that the pressure is off. So you're helping people build that experience, you're helping people understand the complexity of the decisions, you're giving people enough time to make decisions and sort of go wrong. Right, so you got to give people enough time to go wrong and correct their mistakes, and understanding the cost of failure. So I think practice creates the culture, and I think that's most effective when practicing on low decisions. So that might be something that's not on the board's agenda. That doesn't mean that it's not a valuable practice or learning experience for others. And so just I think sharing the decision making and dividing that up based on high load versus low load is quite a good way of thinking about it, and developing that culture of decision making. Matt, do you have oh yeah, go on, Nick.
I just wanted to add to that. So I think, just going back to that previous slide, just want to put that back up for a second again. I think as a group, you need to be wise to what happens when high load decisions come up. They need more planning beforehand to avoid the problems that can occur with that more emotional content. So it's easy to rate, it says it on the slide here, it's a great slide, but it's easy to make decisions and to be decisive in a low load environment. The more you practice, like the more challenging decisions, the better you get at it. But being wise to it, being smart to it, being smart to what can happen, you plan in advance, you prepare for the conversation, you remind people of the pitfalls, and that can be super helpful for even just for a half an hour conversation that could spin out of control, and will lead to a decision which is supported. So when that accountability is being felt, your colleagues will then rally around and back you up rather than punishing, to David's point earlier. So just practicing around this, I think, is really crucial, and they're great points.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Equally, the point Nick brought up earlier about having a chair on your board to oversee the decision making. I think sort of emotion and bias are things which will all naturally occur and can't be avoided. So all you can really do is practice on picking those up as they occur. So the more practice you can get, and the better outside perspective you can have, the less those natural biases and emotions can play on your decision making.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting with chair because they're seen to be neutral. That's because we've categorized the chair, sort of is in the job spec to be neutral and to be independent. And so because that's, in a way, because that's written down and the specific role of the chair, they are then seen to be that independent, neutral perspective. So they become sort of the mediator in some extent, to some extent. And so that's not necessary. So the chair is really important, but that's the identity doesn't have to be restricted to the chair. So we can all practice neutrality and we can all practice independence just by thinking about our perspectives in a different way. So I think it's really interesting to talk about the identity of roles. You know, the CEO looking to be decisive and the chair to be neutral and independent, and actually that, you know, they sometimes can be helpful to step more into neutrality as CEO, just to see what other thoughts come through. I just want to wrap up the conversation and summarise there as we sort of tick over after 9:30, but we'll be sticking on if you want to sort of have us answer any of your questions. I think the summary point is that decisions, the pressure of the decision triggers emotion, so we need to be aware of what they are and are they the right emotion to be making the decision, and then what can we do to sort of rebalance that information, the emotion, sorry, and normally that's going and seeking out other informations, but also understanding our emotions a bit better in the decision making process itself. And then as emotions increase, there are all sorts of biases that are going on as well. And so bias is more likely to happen when we are of increased emotion. So just being aware of what your biases are and really challenge yourself on the upcoming decisions, and perhaps just check yourself on some of the biases listed on our slide, because I think it's really important just to make sure that you're thinking about the diverse thoughts that you have to make sure you've got all the information. There's a culture of this challenge and debate, but also it's fundamentally about practice as well. We'll formally wrap up the slides there, but like I say, please dive in with your questions. We'll be sticking on. So our final strategy cafe in the next webinar is going to be on communication. So David Gray, head of marketing, who's online. Perhaps you can just put a few. What we're going to cover in that, David?
So we'll be focusing on the topic of communication, but so broad. Where do you start with communication? We'll be trying to drill down what it means for leaders. So we'll be looking at when communication fails and what does great communication look like, for example, and maybe looking at the different channels of communication that leaders might use. So hopefully it'll be a nice, broad and robust conversation for people to tune into, and they get some value out of it. So that's on the 2nd of July. I'm thinking we might extend it to 40 minutes because there seems to be too much conversation for 30 minutes. Yeah, we might be prepared to sit on for an extra 10 minutes, guys. Yeah. But do join us.
I'm sure we'll have lots of questions, but actually we've just had one form of communication, sort of the face-to-face next to each other, just sort of wiped out of our sort of menu choice of communication methods. So it'd be interesting to sort of see what else we can be doing and how best to be communicating. I'm looking, I don't know, Nick, can you see any questions? I'm struggling to see sort of things coming through on my end. I just wondered whether any questions have come through.
There's good question. How can you work to overcome a naturally indecisive leadership style? Who wants to pick up on that?
There's all sorts of reasons why people don't make a decision. So normally it comes from a place of fear. So is there a fear around making a decision, about committing to a choice? I mean, ultimately that's what it is. Is there a fear of making the wrong decision or it going wrong? And I think to combat that, it's about getting the information and practicing it and starting small. So I think indecisiveness comes from, there's a lack of inclination, a lack of motivation. And that, normally for me, it comes from a place of fear, but interesting to see what other people think about indecisiveness.
I've got a comment on that. I'd question whether that person is making the decisions in isolation or whether they have people around them to bounce the decision-making criteria off. I've got a close to home personal example. Last night I was out walking the dog with my wife, and she knew the outcome. She wanted to ask me a question about her the future of her job, and she knew what the outcome was that she wanted, but she just needed to bounce it off me and get my confirmation. And sometimes people get stuck in that. They kind of know which is the right direction, but they're afraid to push the button. And sometimes maybe having someone else, a confidant that you can go to, or a number of them around you, is actually quite a nice way of moving that along.
Great point.
I once worked with CEO through coaching, and one of the issues that he wanted to bring up was crippling anxiety whenever any critical decisions came up. Which just made his, so the way he would describe it is, it just scatter his brain at that point. He was doing fine, and then this critical decision would come up, and it would absolutely send him into a spin psychologically. And the issues there ran deep, and actually sort of digging into it, there was a lot going on about his self-belief, his self-construct as a leader. He had quite a big negative dialogue going on to do with a sense of his identity within his family, his success relative to his grandfather and his brother, and all of this. And so really what was going on was, in the context of business, was a lot of self-doubt. And that self-doubt would lead to a sort of crippling negative inner dialogue whenever anything serious came up. He was basically telling himself he was going to fail. So actually talking therapy really there was super helpful, just working through those issues and reframing them. And then as Rosanna says, just practicing around some critical decisions and learning to work with others and learning to trust his own gut instinct, which actually was good. So he had all the resourcefulness, and just in certain circumstances, that context brought out that self-doubt, and we really had to work through that with him and resolve it by tackling some of the deeper issues. And I'm going to say that he grew through that process, faced some of his demons and talked them out and resolved them, and has been much more successful as a business person since then. So yeah,
just on a really practical level, sometimes like the amount of decisions can also be stifling. And so where do I start? And so if somebody is has an identity of being indecisive, maybe just pick one decision and remove the worry about all the other decisions and just pick one to focus on. Practice by just doing one thing and sort of just do it. But I think you can intellectually understand how to make decisions, but we've gone through some interesting things to think about, but actually the point here is about practicing it, and you have to do that, and so you actually just have to make a decision to practice it. So I think if people are struggling, maybe you've got indecisive team members, maybe just pick one thing and go from there.
We haven't talked about competency too much today. We've talked, we talked about competency around the decision-making process, but actual competency, and I think the business environment challenges individuals on technical competencies across a broad range of spectra. And so, you could find that you're pretty good at making a decision in one space because you have the knowledge and experience, but you're not in a broader space. And so I think also just being honest about that with colleagues. For example, maybe you say to yourself, I get away with it when I'm reading the finances, but I don't really fully understand what they mean. And I rely heavily on our finance director for that, but I'm unable to call him or her out if I think there's something wrong with it because I don't have that self-confidence in my own knowledge. So doing your gap analysis around your operational competency, I think, is really important. If you've got a high-level leadership role, you need to make sure you're well informed and you have that capability in place, and that will always help. So it's experience and training, will really, cut through in some of these circumstances where actually it shouldn't be high load because it's possible to get the competency. And if you haven't got it, you reach out for expertise.
That
Yeah,
requires trust.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point on being decisive. Is it's a lot easier to be decisive when you're armed with more information and you have more competency. And the less you have, the more you can get stuck in inertia and questioning yourself. And it sort of builds on Rosanna's point as well. I think getting a bit of momentum, communicating with your team, and practicing, getting that feedback on you are well equipped to deal with these decisions, yeah, can help you build up some momentum and sort of overcome that inertia.
I have seen the opposite, so just maybe a last point to chew over. There's a question about how do you overcome a naturally indecisive leadership style. We've probably all seen leaders who think that the decision rests with them and sort of fight for it, because I guess there's an identity around being the CEO or the managing director that you should be making the decision, and can be resentful about senior leaders in the organization cutting across you and trying to prevent it. So maybe over decisiveness is another thing just to watch out for. What do you guys think about that?
Absolutely. I think this is about practicing what works as a leadership style. So in the context of whatever meeting or problem that you're facing. So the balance between, I guess we're thinking about collaborative leadership versus decisive. So when do you actually, how much of the decision making do you share, and just practicing and knowing, it's about knowing these sort of individuals, getting into a bit of a rhythm of how you sort of work together. But I think leadership is all about choice of style in the moment. And so if one thing doesn't work, maybe keeping to try with that leadership style maybe it's sort of going to be self-fulfilling, so maybe trying a different approach. But the only thing I would come back to is there are times, on this slide where it's like, actually we just ultimately the responsibility is about leading with decisiveness when there's high cost of failure, there's urgent needs, and we're sort of trying to prevent that culture of inertia.
A question in here on how do you counter action decision making bias from I think it's from Joanna. Thank you, Joanna. How do you counter an action decision making bias?
Oh, yeah. So, well, you mean, are you aware that you're making an action bias? So it's just about having that extra step by checking yourself. So if you resonate with that, it's about a tendency. And so you might be reflecting on previous decisions that you may have, or somebody else might have, about the way that they make decisions. I think this is really about education and being aware that there are biases at play. So to counter an action bias, you might have a check where you're about to make a decision and then you come away and decide that you're going to sleep on it. Or you have a period of time which creates a time lag, which stops that reaction impulsivity to making the decision.
I agree. I think so. So for an MD or a CEO who's suffering from a compulsion to make the decision, that action orientation as opposed to do nothing is a better answer, or wait, there might be a better answer, or get counsel might be a better answer. Coaching can definitely help, because it's recognition of the impulse in yourself is the first point, that consciousness, and then some practice around deferring the impulse would probably what you would do through coaching. I think then in an organizational setting, my point of view is the construction of the leadership and the governance. So you need people around the leader who are prepared to stand their ground and just say stop, and then hold the group at stop until it's been talked out. And that takes some courage. So in these big high pressure decisions, I think it is on us as leaders to be accountable and step up and use our courage to call out and call stop, but then to also be flexible and to listen, and not just to hold that position you know, for its own sake. It's you've got to then be open and to work out the answer. But the power of no, I think, is really important here, and you need to try and build that around the leadership team.
Yeah, I just wonder how much conversation there is across the organisation as well of bias. So this isn't, I mean, in this context, it's about leadership, but bias happens in all sorts of decisions, sales, purchases, you know, people management, and you know, there's a wider conversation to be had with the organisation about biases, because you might be aware, but if everybody around in your sort of decision-making group aren't aware, then that sort of is also hindering. So and the other thing I would say is there might be somebody that has more of a status quo bias, which is sort of on the other side of the spectrum in terms of you know, making decisions. You know, maybe you know somebody to be more cautious and more slow and patient. So maybe team selection as well, just having somebody who doesn't also have that action bias. So I just want to wrap up there. Thank you for the questions, Joanna, and we will have this recorded. We hope to see you all in a couple of weeks on the 2nd of July on our strategy cafe on communication. Thank you so much for everybody for joining and sticking around till 9:50, and it's just great to be able to share this with you despite the times that we're in. So thank you very much for coming along. Please do share the recording if you found it valuable, and we're happy to have a conversation with you as well offline. So have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you in a few weeks for the next Strategy Cafe. So thank you very much.
Bye, guys.